Hello, my name is William Challenger, and today I will be discussing psychiatric disorders among U.S. troops in the Pacific during World War II. While the Pacific War is often remembered for decisive battles, strategic victories, and eventual American triumph, it also produces a quieter and less visible crisis: widespread psychiatric breakdown among U.S. troops. Using Ben Shepard's A War of Nerves, Ken Burns' The War, and John Hudson's Let There Be Light, I argue that psychological collapse in the Pacific was not an individual failure, but it was a predictable outcome of prolonged combat, environmental extremity, and institutional pressures that prioritize manpower over long-term mental health. The Pacific Theater presented conditions unlike almost any previous American war. Combat took place among isolated islands such as Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Soldiers endured jungle heat, tropical disease, constant moisture. Unlike Europe, there were often fewer secure areas. Rest was limited. Units rotated less frequently. Soldiers were frequently exposed to relentless combat with an enemy that rarely surrendered. In Shepard's A War of Nerves, the author explains that 20th century industrial warfare created new psychological pressures because of its intensity and duration. The Pacific magnified those pressures. Ken Burns' The War reinforces this point through interviews with veterans who describe not just fear but exhaustion, a kind of emotional depletion that accumulates over months. That leads to my central research question. How did prolonged combat in the Pacific shape psychiatric disorders among U.S. troops, and how did the U.S. Army respond to these breakdowns? This question matters because it forces us to look beyond tactics and strategy and examine the human mind as part of military history. My thesis is psychiatric disorders among U.S. troops in the Pacific were not isolated signs of weakness, but predictable responses to prolonged combat, environmental stress, and institutional pressure that prioritize manpower over long-term mental health. A War of Nerves makes it clear that nearly all soldiers have psychological breaking points if exposed to sustained combat. Breakdown was not rare, it was a statistical expectation. At the same time, the Army's psychiatric system was designed to primarily to return soldiers to duty quickly, not to provide long-term healing. The tension between care and combat shaped treatment for thousands of men. This subject remains relevant because what was once called combat fatigue would later evolve into what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, formally acknowledged in 1980. The Vietnam War forced public recognition of long-term psychological trauma, but A War of Nerves shows a clear continuity between World War II cases and modern diagnosis. Even today, stigma remains within military culture. Understanding World War II helps us see that psychological injury has always accompanied warfare, even when it was hidden. The Pacific War, categorized by ambitious invasions, close-quarter jungle fighting, and extremely high casualty rates, soldiers often faced hidden enemies, ambushes, and suicidal resistance. In The War, veterans described The unpredictability, not knowing where the next shot would come from, that unpredictability created constant hypervigilance. Unlike earlier wars, soldiers were rarely given time for emotional rest. Fear was not a single moment, it became continuous. During World War II, psychiatric breakdown was often labeled as combat fatigue or war neurosis. Symptoms included uncontrollably crying, psychiatric paralysis, memory loss, panic attacks, and emotional withdrawal. Some soldiers become unable to speak, while others froze in combat. In Let There Be Light, John Hudson documents soldiers hospitalized for psychiatric conditions. We see men who physically shake, who struggle to articulate thoughts, and who describe overwhelming anxiety. The film makes it clear that these men were not cowards, but many of them had served bravely for months before collapsing. A war of nerves presents a critical argument. The longer a soldier remains in combat, the higher the likelihood of psychological breakdown. The Pacific intensified these patterns because of its limited rotation and extreme environmental conditions. Soldiers experienced high levels of stress, and each firefight added to a growing psychological burden. Eventually, the mind could no longer process constant danger. Campaigns such as Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa saw rising psychiatric evacuations as fighting dragged on. In The War, veterans described reaching a point where it was simply felt empty, not dramatic fear, just emotional exhaustion. This supports the argument that breakdown was not immediate panic, but a gradual erosion. By Okinawa in 1945, psychiatric casualties had become a significant logistical concern. Discussion 2. The Army developed what had become known as forward psychiatry. The principle was simple: treat soldiers close to the front, treat them immediately, and communicate the expectation that they would return to duty. This approach, sometimes summarized as proximity, intimacy, was aimed to prevent long-term hospitalization. The goal was rapid stabilization, not deep psychological analysis. Soldiers were often given sedation, rest, and brief counseling. Most were sent back to combat within days. John Hudson, Let There Be Light, is crucial evidence of how the Army viewed psychiatric treatment publicly. The film presents compassionate therapy sessions that show soldiers recovering. However, it reveals vulnerability. Men crying, shaking, confessing fear. The Army suppressed the film for decades, concerning it might harm public morale or challenge the ideas of masculine toughness. The Army's suppression of the film for this suppression revealed the tension between acknowledging psychological injury and maintaining the image of invincible soldiers. Discussion 3. Military culture in World War II emphasized endurance, masculinity, and resilience. In the war, veterans recall feeling ashamed when they could not continue. They feared being labeled weak. A War of Nerves explains the This stigma often delayed treatment, worsening symptoms. Soldiers sometimes hid distress until under total collapse. Here we see a fundamental conflict. Psychiatrists thought to treat suffering, the military thought to maintain fighting strength. Forward psychiatry reduced evacuation rates and preserved manpower, but it also meant that soldiers were frequently returned home to the same traumatic conditions that caused the breakdown in the first place. Care was shaped by wartime necessity. This does not mean psychiatrists were indifferent, but institutional priorities mattered. A war of nerves strongly suggests that psychological breakdown in the industry was nearly inevitable if exposure lasts long enough. The Pacific was a laboratory for extreme stress, constant threat, brutal combat, isolation, and limited relief. Under those conditions, the nervous system reaches limits. Breakdown occurred in Europe as well, but environmental stressors differed. In Europe, there were more defined front lines and much more accessible rest zones. In the Pacific, jungle terrain and isolation intensified emotional strain. Veterans in the war repeatedly described the Pacific as a uniquely exhausting and psychologically draining. The language did change over time. In World War II, it was combat fatigue, but after Vietnam, psychiatric advocacy led to the formal recognition of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in the year 1980. Yet the symptoms described in Let There Be Light closely resemble modern PTSD criteria: intrusive memories, emotional numbness, anxiety, and functional impairment. This continuity is unmistakable. World War II is often remembered as the Good War, but the war complicates that memory by centering veterans' emotional scars. Many return home unable to discuss what they have experienced. These wounds were invisible but lasting. If we limit military history to battles and strategies, we erase critical dimensions of human cost. Discussion question 1. Did the Pacific environment and tactical conditions of the Pacific theater create a distinct psychological experience compared to Europe, or were the breakdown patterns fundamentally similar across the theaters? Fundamentally, I believe the breakdown patterns were very similar. It comes down to key factors being stress, level of expectation, and the day-to-day environment. While the Pacific Theater did have very specific environmental challenges and such as jungle combat and Sorry, I had an issue with my mic there. Did the specific environmental tactical conditions of the Pacific Theater create a distinct psychological experience compared to Europe, or were breakdown patterns fundamentally similar across the theaters? While breakdown patterns are somewhat similar across the board, key factors being stress related and environmental challenges, the Pacific Theater had very specific environmental challenges that added onto that, whether that be jungle heat, disease, close quarter jungle combat, or an enemy that rarely surrendered. The Pacific Theater had very different psychological experiences that added to that stress compared to Europe that had more defined front lines, areas for rest, and frequent rotation between soldiers on the front lines. We move to question 2. Was the Army's use of forward psychiatry primarily a humanitarian effort to help soldiers, or a strategic tool designed to preserve manpower? Can it be both at once? Yes, I believe it can be both at once. While in this particular instance, the entering World War II as late as the United States did was the immense manpower their army had over the Allies and Axis powers. When psychiatric breakdowns would occur, it would be in the U.S. Army's best interest to preserve that manpower by using forward psychiatry, keeping soldiers close to the line, just taking a few days, sedation, rest, and counseling, and sending them back to the front line. While ideally you would want a more humanitarian effort to help soldiers, such as being able to rotate front lines and having something similar to the Europe theater, where having those more defined front lines would be able to give the soldiers a sense of emotional rest in certain areas. While hindsight's always 20/20, I believe moving forward, a humanitarian effort to help soldiers would be a strategic tool designed to preserve manpower as a byproduct. Moving into question 3, why might societies celebrate physical bravery while remaining uncomfortable with psychological vulnerability? This is a question as old as society itself. Societies will celebrate physical bravery while remaining uncomfortable with psychological vulnerability, because that vulnerability breaks down the idea of masculinity, which in that sense is the physical bravery, the physical admiration. So having one doesn't allow you to have the other one. They are opposite sides of the same coin. And so the psychological vulnerability is the harder struggle, is that harder battle than physical bravery. And not being able to comfortably deal with that through decades of society putting that down and building the pressure up with psychological vulnerability allows the breakthrough to be more than the physical admiration, the physical bravery. But our society, along with many societies in the past, don't see it that way. We celebrate the physical bravery as being more brave, as being more admirable than being psychologically vulnerable. But as we see time and time again, psychological vulnerability allows us to continue to achieve acts of physical bravery, allows us to continuously adapt and become better psychologically and physically. Combat fatigue in the Pacific was widespread, predictable, and deeply shaped by environmental and institutional pressures. A War of Nerves provides an analytical framework showing a breakdown of structural feature of industrial war. The war humanizes the experience through testimony, and Let There Be Light visually documents psychiatric suffering and recovering while revealing the Army's discomfort with public vulnerability. Together, these sources show that World War II was not only a war of strategy and firepower, but also a war of nerves. Understanding this demonstration reshapes how we interpret military history and reminds us that psychological injury has always been a part of warfare, even when hidden. Thank you for listening.